to give you some insight, or at least the insights I've been able to develop about how it is that your physiology speaks to your mind. And I think the way to conceptualize that, I'm trying to give you some sense of what symbols are. Now, what Freud thought about symbols was that, well, let's say that you were in a society that was very sexually repressive, and you were still stuck with the problem of a fairly powerful sex drive, and your culture had taught you that that needed to be suppressed and repressed and controlled. And Freud's idea was that, well, that thing like the monster in the basement doesn't really like to be pushed around and controlled, and it's going to manifest its desires and its wants and its view of the world in subversive form. So, and for Freud, the subversive forms would be different sorts of symbols. So if you weren't satisfying the system that was underlying sexual interest, then it would start to insert itself in random ways into your behavior, perhaps when you're interacting with someone of the opposite sex, or maybe into your dreams and your fantasies. And it would do that in a disguised form because, well, because the part of you that was the integrated part, the ego part in some sense, wasn't really willing to communicate with it, so it had to sort of sneak its message up and through. Well, the Jungian take on that was slightly different. Jung was perfectly willing to assume that Freud knew what he was talking about in some domains, especially those that were associated with psychopathology. But for Jung, the realm of symbols was something different. And for Jung, the realm of symbols was where knowledge had its origin. And so you can imagine that there are things that you know absolutely nothing about. And of course, you don't know what those things are because you don't know anything about them. But there's lots of them around. And then you might imagine, and there's also lots of things that exist that the people as a whole don't know anything about, not just you. They're beyond our comprehension as a species. For Jung, the symbol was a mediator between the absolute unknown and the relatively known. And so, as the human imagination expanded out and mastered more and more territory, there was like a periphery around the island of knowledge, and that periphery was made up of symbolic representations that were pre-articulate knowledge. So they were like things you might act out. Here's a way to think about that. So, you know, you might watch a child who's engaged in pretend play. Okay, and often children will pretend to be a mother or a father for obvious reasons, you know, and what they do is they observe their mother or their father, and then they act them out. But it's a very interesting form of acting out because we think of it as imitation. Oh, look, you know, she's imitating her mother. But imitation means you move your arm like this, and I move my arm like this. And that is not what children do when they're playing. What they do instead is a very complex form of generalization. And they watch the mother, and they extract out something like the pattern of the mother, and they don't really understand what that pattern is because they don't have the articulation and the cognitive capacity to generate a fully articulated and verbalized model of the mother, but they act it out in behavior. And so it's, in a sense, they're incorporating the spirit of the mother, that's one way of thinking about it, into their behavior, and then they can act out things they don't understand, or at least they don't understand in terms of being able to articulate them. And you know, lots of things you know you can't articulate. You can't articulate how to walk. You can't articulate how to ride a bike. You can't articulate anything complex like how to engage in a successful relationship. A lot of that knowledge is embodied, assuming you have it at all. So it's dramatic action. And you could also think about the symbol as a mediator between dramatic action and full cognition. So for example, imagine a child is playing at being a mother, and then you stop them and you say, well, what are you doing? And the child might say, well, we're playing house, I'm pretending to be mom. And then you might say, well, how do you go about doing that? And then they're going to try to articulate what they're doing, you know, and while they're doing that, they're going to be using their imagination and representing the things that they're trying to understand. And then you can see how the symbol, which would be the visual representation of the mother's action, like a little movie that you might run in your head, you can see how it might lay itself on top of the dramatic action as a precursor to articulation. And so that's a good way of thinking about it, is that the symbol is a precursor to articulation. And that you use symbols of one form or another whenever you use imaginative representation as a precursor to understanding. And so that happens, for example, when you're fantasizing about something. So And now for the psychoanalysts, particularly for psychoanalysts like Jung, the imagination was something that had a spontaneous operation. It would just go along on its own and do things. And of course, you also experience that if you, first of all, when you dream, obviously, because you're not in control of your dreams, something's in control of them, and they happen, but it's not you, or it's not the you that you normally think of yourself as. And then if you're daydreaming, something analogous happens, you know. You find that maybe you're trying to concentrate on something, and something that's of interest to you for one reason or another starts to creep into the theater of your imagination and lay out different scenarios of one form or another. And it's sort of like the natural language of the psyche, because it isn't obvious that the natural language of the psyche is in fact language, right? Because we don't really know how long human beings have been using formal language. You know, the estimate's 150,000 years. That's one estimate. I doubt if it's more than 2 million years. 2 million years seems to be about how long we've been using fire. So it's somewhere between 2 million and 150,000 years. But compared to the entire history of our cognitive development, you know, which you can stretch back, well, to the beginning of life itself if you want, or at least to the point where things had nervous systems, that's more like 500 million years. And so the psyche was operating without language for a much longer period of time that was operating with language, and it was doing something to organize its conceptions of the world that were pre-linguistic.